Wayne, you're on mute.
Yes, because he's on the telephone.
We are live.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the University City Council to order on April 29th, 2020. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Clay.
Present.
Councilmember Carr.
Present.
Councilmember McMahon.
Here.
Councilmember Hales.
Here.
Councilmember Kusick.
Here.
Councilmember Smotherson.
Here.
Mayor Crowe.
Here, thank you very much. You have before you the agenda that you were given, I believe yesterday, Could I have a motion, please, for approval of the agenda? Motion made by Ms. Carr, seconded by Mr. Clay. Is there discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it. The citizen participation, just so the public knows who are viewing us, that we did have 2 citizen comments that were provided to members of council prior to this meeting. All members of council have received the citizen comments, and we appreciate the time and effort that our citizens put into providing those to us. Mr. Rose, I'll turn it over to you.
Honorable Mayor and council members, item E1 asks the council to consider the creation of a small business assistance forgivable loan program.
I need an invite to the
The proposed program is intended to provide eligible businesses with much needed financial assistance as a result of the coronavirus economic impacts. The proposed program is recommended for approval by the Economic Development Retail Sales Tax Board and me. Mr. Cross, would you present this item?
Yes, thank you, City Manager Rose. I think many of you and much of the public viewed the meeting the other night for the EDRST board, where we took this before them for their recommendation of this proposal. As we mentioned the other night, this is proposing to go via 2 rounds, where the first round will be based on eligibility of the federal programs, and the second round will be based upon a less restrictive program. So there was some discussion, and they presented the recommendation of approval to the mayor and council, and that's why we're bringing it to you tonight.
Would be happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
Yes, so I believe that most people, I know everyone on council got the agenda with all of the attachments. I'm happy to help in any way that I can as far as what the EDRST was desirous of. But I think all the council members are pretty well, have a pretty good working knowledge of this as well. It's been very fluid as we move through it. Mr. Smotherson.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mayor Crowe. I just wanted to hopefully ask this question. I do understand the purpose of this and the whole point of it, but I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the city being in the situation that we are in, that we are, I mean, we're struggling too. I mean, as stated by the city manager, we've got a 3.7 million shortfall. So I'm going to put this out there and explain myself. But the one aspect of it that I'm kind of hoping that we can remove is, instead of making this a forgivable loan, to just make it a loan. Now, and the reason I say that is because in respect to the fact that even though the EDRST fund has nothing to do with the situation that we let go or laid off or furloughed 15 people. And that to me is absolutely critical. I mean, we're in the situation of some of these businesses in that we laid off people. And that to me is, I think we have to respect that action, even though, again, I'm understanding that this fund has nothing to do with, one has nothing to do with the other, but out of just respect and being in the situation also with the fact that this city is how we don't know what the next step is. We don't know when the end of this will be. So I'm just asking, I'm wondering if we can actually make that change, and it's just a small change in that instead of it being a forgivable loan to just be a loan.
Mr. Rose?
Honorable Mayor, two things. Councilmember Smotherson, you're correct that the funds that are proposed to be used are limited, or I'm sorry, restricted for economic development purposes. As it relates to whether the change can be made, yes, that's a policy decision that would be made by the mayor and council.
At the present time, the loans are, am I correct, they are forgivable, but forgivable at our discretion or forgivable from the onset?
Honorable Mayor, there are criteria that they must meet in order for the loan to be forgivable. That criteria is tied very closely to
The federal, yeah.
restoring jobs. And so if they're able to restore jobs, the thought is that the economy is spurred. Thus, we would get our funding back really through a more robust economy. But again, that's a policy decision that you and the council make.
And I did not, and well, I guess, one of the things that came up, and I did not come in with the summary of it, I touched on it on Monday. The focus of this loan is intended to allow those businesses to obtain a forgivable loan based upon what they basically put into the fund through their annual fees. So basically 100% of what they put in is what they're eligible to obtain. And as indicate, I mean, that's a policy decision, but in a sense, it's just a reimbursement of their contributions already made into the 2019 funds.
I believe, Mr. Kusick, did you have a question?
Yes, sir. I have two questions. If a company is eligible for the PPP program, are they still eligible for any of the money from this program?
Mr. Rose, you're muted.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Kusick, yes, they are. They would be eligible for this program. In fact, we are tying the first round to you being approved for a federal program, whether that's PPP or a small business loan. The idea is that they will have demonstrated the viability of the business within this economic environment. And it will reduce the amount of resources that the city will need to dedicate towards staff oversight of this program. So we wanted to have a process that was easy to be quickly implemented and that minimized the amount of oversight that would be needed.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought. And then I know that during the ERST meeting, they discussed some of the larger employers in University City that would not necessarily need any of these funds. What's being done in consideration for some of the larger employers in University City? Are they also going to be eligible for reimbursement of their business licenses?
The way that the Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Kusick, the way the program is structured, it really targets small businesses. As you have reviewed and saw where we are excluding businesses such as franchises, the belief is that those businesses that are larger, more sophisticated, probably have been able to take advantage of the federal level programs at a greater degree than what some of the smaller businesses here would have been able to take advantage of those same type of programs. So that's the reason that we structured it in a manner that says you simply need to be approved for one of those programs. It doesn't mean that you've received funding, but it does indicate that that you have a viable business in this economy.
Good. Thank you for that clarification. That's all I have.
Ms. Carr?
Thank you, Mayor. Assuming that, well, in round one, they have to be PPP qualified or certified. What if they have already received some funding? does that eliminate them, or are we paying them double?
Mayor Pro Tem, the way that this program is structured is that it really is intended to leverage the funding that companies have received or could possibly receive. So whether if you have received funding through the PPP program or small business loan program, you would still be eligible for these funds. Also, if you were simply approved and had not received funding through those programs, you would still be eligible for this program as it's currently structured.
And then I had one more question, Mayor, if I may. So I understand that this will be a simple vote, but it seems to me, since it's a policy that it, well, let me ask it a different way. Why are we not considering this as a resolution or even as an ordinance as opposed to just a simple vote?
That's more of a legal issue, and I'll defer to John. I don't know that it was required, but I'd like for him to chime in.
No, I think in the past, we've done these as city manager report items where the council approves it on a vote, which is similar to a resolution. It has legally, it's the same effect. It's an order authorizing the appropriation of these EDRST funds for the purpose requested.
And does is that similar to when they submit a budget? Because I thought at that point we needed a resolution to approve the budget, or we maybe even needed a resolution to approve their budget if we didn't include it in the general budget.
Well, I think so. The EDRST fund is a separate fund, and the council determines how those funds should be spent. And the practice has been, and I think it's consistent with U City's laws, is to have that approval by way of a motion, which is legally it has the same effect as a resolution, as I indicated. Technically, if you could put it with you could appropriate these funds with your annual budget if you'd like. But as you know, that will not be coming up for another couple of months before the fiscal year will begin. And so by doing it this way, and in effect, you're appropriating these and amending your budget with respect to this particular fund accordingly. So this is an acceptable way to do it. You could do it by resolution, I suppose, if you wanted. An ordinance would be unnecessary. But again, a motion and a resolution basically would have the same effect.
Thank you.
I don't have everybody on the screen, but I've got a few. Mr. Clay.
Thank you, Mayor Crow. Have a question or two in kind of three areas. Don't have that many questions in total, but communication, accountability, and equity. And I'll start with communication. We heard a little bit in the proceedings of the EDRST meeting that there is multiple modalities going to be used to reach out to businesses. And we even heard a question, I think, from the mayor about translation into foreign languages. Could you give an update on the modalities that we're going to use to communicate, and then update on the languages?
Sure. Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, if the program is approved, the first thing that will happen is a press release will go out. That will occur either tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. Secondly, we'll send out a postcard. Our communications director, Allison Bamberger, is working with Cliff. And the intention is to have that postcard go out in both languages. So that might take a little bit of time so that we can ensure both Mandarin as well as in English, so that we can ensure that we're hitting a very broad market. Also, we intend to provide information. We have a business news, electronic newsletter that we will use, that we will distribute information about the program on as well. We also have an electronic newsletter that goes out to the general public, and we will provide information in that newsletter also. There was some concern that has been expressed relative to, the businesses being closed. And so we have, as you recall, we have the emails. We're also looking at robocalls. We're not certain about that platform, but we're going to take a very close look to see if we can use that too. We do have phone numbers from the various business license, and if we can pull a robocall together, we hope to be able to use those.
Yeah, I think the calling is going to be critically important because folks may not be picking up mail. I think email is good. Could you say a word about social media?
Yes, all of this will be posted on our social media platforms. That's just standard as far as it relates to how we distribute information.
Okay. To equity, and I think communication is a big piece of that. We know that, for example, the Loop has the Loop Business District, which is very clicked into things. They're going to have folks applying as soon as this thing hits the streets. But in terms of the funding, as I'm understanding it, it's related to the funds you put in, and that was articulated earlier. The funds you put into EDRST is the maximum amount of what you can get out. And it's my understanding the breakdown. If we look at the business areas, for lack of a better term, we have the Loop clearly, and then Olive. Olive actually puts in some 36%, I believe, was the figure quoted.
That's correct.
Okay. And so I think there's, to our businesses on Olive, to those who know businesses on Olive, and really anywhere in University City, but there's a large chunk there that the businesses on Olive can extract. And so certainly I hope the word gets out to them to be able to take advantage of that, because that would be significant. As it relates to accountability, the mayor has articulated the challenge of moving very fast in a government process that is not accustomed to moving this quickly. And we want to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Can you talk a little bit about what oversight will look like of this program? So we've got the money out on the back end. How do we know it's done the things it's supposed to do on the back end? I'll let you answer that, and then I have one more piece associated with that.
I will start. Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, I'll start, and then I'll have Cliff chime in as well. But the reason we structured the program so very closely tied to a federal program or a small business association type program is so that we were certain that they had gone through a approval process that for the most part assured their viability long-term in this economic environment. As it relates to oversight, those programs typically require you to provide certain, once you hit a threshold, you have to report that you have done this. That's how we will know whether there is, whether you have actually achieved keeping those jobs on board or returning those jobs to the business. So there's going to be oversight there where they are required to do some reporting indicating that they have met certain thresholds. Mr. Cross, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, that pretty much covered it. And I think one of the reasons why, and we indicated this the other night, of the double round is the ability to have oversight and the restrictions that staff has. And we made it clear that round one, in a sense, is going to be, oversight's going to be conducted by a higher power in terms of the state and federal guidelines. And when they're in compliance with that, they're obviously in compliance with our code. Round two, the restrictions are much less restrictive, which is why we structured it that way. And really all it does, really the only guidelines in round two is that the business reopens within a couple weeks of obtaining this. and that they officially request the loan forgiveness by a deadline date. Other than that, as long as they meet those particular guidelines, they're in compliance with the program guidelines.
So let me ask this final piece as it relates to accountability. I know we moved through this process very quickly, and I laud the EDRST for getting themselves together, and my colleagues on the council for moving so quickly. I want to make sure we've met all the steps we need to take to get to this point and to take the vote this evening. For example, is there a need for a public hearing? Is there anything else that we needed to do on the front end to accommodate the speed in which we're doing this?
Well, I can let John address the public hearing, but what I can say, when we accounted for the numbers, and maybe I should have added more to the summary. I just assumed that we would, from the meeting the other night, that it was understood where these funds came from. These funds, basically, when you look at our section of the EDRST, there's basically 3 areas in which we allocate funds. And that comes from section 12050 of, or 520 of the code, and how we can distribute the revenue. And basically 25% of that has to be earmarked for administrative projects. An additional minimum of 20% has to be used for what we would assume would be long-range economic development projects or infrastructure projects. So theoretically, 55% of the funding that's generated from the EDRST funds are eligible for training programs, for marketing, for providing grants. In looking at this particular grant and how it compared to the state statute as well, it was our understanding that this qualified under that. So I know John can answer the public hearing question, but in terms of how we being accountable and properly distributing these funds, we feel comfortable that we're meeting the intent and the requirements of both our code and the state statute.
Mr. Mulligan.
Thank you, Mayor. With respect to the public hearing issue, the code states that one of the duties of the board is to consider economic development plans, projects, or designations of economic development areas, and hold public hearings in connection with those, and but that's subject to the approval of the city council. The process is that the EDRST board would consider those and make any recommendations to the council, and their timelines in the code for that, which are not relevant here. But it states the council shall have the final determination on the use and expenditure of the fund. So one question is this a plan, project, or area within the meaning of the code? And there are no definitions for those terms. And so when we looked at this, it wasn't sent to the EDRST board in advance by the city council. So the question is whether that provision even applies. But even if it does, and it's considered a economic development project within the meaning of the code, there has to be a public hearing. There is no definition or standards for a public hearing in the ordinance. So we can look to case law in Missouri on that. There is nothing specifically dealing with EDRST board public hearings, but the Missouri Supreme Court in the zoning context in 2015 in a case in Franklin County discussed what a hearing is. And it's basically, it's a session in which testimony is taken from witnesses. There's an opportunity to be heard, presents one side of a case, or to be generally known or appreciated, listening to arguments. And basically it's a dictionary definition. So the court said, really, in sum, it's giving speakers an opportunity to address the subject of, in the context of zoning, of a zoning amendment. So What we did, and it was the chair said that it was an emergency meeting, but it still met the sunshine requirements for a normal meeting. Everybody was given the opportunity to present their views by way of written comments. That, and in fact, some were received. Those comments were all provided to the board before it voted on this particular program. So, you know, ideally, we would have offered oral comments as we typically do, citizen participation before there's a vote on it. But because of the coronavirus COVID-19 circumstances, we limited it to written comments, but everybody had an opportunity to do that, and those were considered by the board. There are some court cases in the context of due process when you're depriving somebody of life, liberty, or property, something we're not talking about here, but there's even a higher standard for due process when you talk about having a hearing. And there have been cases, the US Supreme Court, for instance, has said that it's a flexible concept, and it's possible that you can satisfy it by just providing an opportunity for written evidence. So when you look at the case law in Missouri as well as in the US Supreme Court, I think that certainly there was an opportunity for the public to comment on this and to observe the actual hearing itself or the board meeting that was made available to the public. It was an open meeting. So I think it would satisfy the requirement that there be a hearing on this program.
Thank you. I think we need to move to Mr. Smotherson.
Well, again, I just wanted to make sure that we address because my question hasn't been answered, but I guess it has been, in that it's a policy decision by the council, and that is, I would like us to consider that it not be forgivable, because again, unless you're telling me that we don't need the money as a city, and if the city manager could explain, is this something that is going to be replenished, or if it's forgivable and that million is gone, it's just gone? Is that correct?
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Smotherson, I think that the coronavirus emergency has presented us with a very unique situation. And the reason that the program is being recommended, up under normal circumstances, we would not be recommending a forgivable loan program in this manner. It's only because of the devastating economic impacts that the coronavirus has had on the local economy that we're recommending this program to you. So the funds will, the sales tax that existed to create the funds is still in existence. So certainly it is believed that the sales tax will still continue to generate revenues, albeit not at the same level as what it has in the past. In fact, in the proposed budget, we are reducing that amount to about half of the amount that it has produced in the past, but it will still generate next year, like we're proposing about $334,000 from what I recall. So, you know, it's strictly a policy decision by the mayor and council on whether you think that this program should be forgivable if they're able to meet certain criteria, or if you want it structured just as a straight out loan.
And what I would suggest is, as we move through the questions from all of our colleagues, if in fact, once we finish with our questions, Mr. Smotherson, if you want to make a motion, you can see if you get a second and then move forward that way, so we can figure that part out. And I can't, did anyone else, did I get everyone who had asked questions? Looks to be like everyone. I do think that a couple of things to note here is that I think the first wave, if you will, the phase one is designed to be quick, simple, and get money on the streets with oversight provided similar to the PPP program on a federal level. It is going to, I think, going to have limited applications, and I think it's going to move through pretty quickly. I think the larger, more robust is going to be phase 2. And frankly, correct me if I'm wrong, if during phase 1 we have this big, I don't want to open up too big a can of worms, but if something happens in phase 1 that we're concerned about, I assume we've got the flexibility to adjust for phase 2. We're moving at a pretty breakneck page here. So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on this one. I also would, in response to Councilman Smith, I truly understand where you're coming from. The only thing I'd also say is, unless I'm missing it, we're one of the very few communities that has this opportunity to even do this, because very few communities, whoever the business leaders were way before all of us, who set up the Economic Development Retail Sales Tax Board, they gave us a degree of flexibility that most of our communities don't have. That we have these funds available that don't impact our city operations to too much of a degree, and that they're set aside for this type of a purpose. And so I'm glad we have them. I typically would be right with Councilmember Smotherson, because I think that loans taken out should be loans paid back. In this particular case, I'm not sure that when we see all the businesses that are clearly struggling at this time and trying to get back on their feet, I'm not sure that that asking them to go into debt and pay it back is something that's going to help out as much as it should be. But that's, we all have different opinions on this. Someone raised their hand, but I apologize, I don't know who it was. Mr. Hales.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to follow up on something you said about flexibility, and I watched the EDRST meeting yesterday, as I know many of us did. And so this is kind of a question to the city manager, probably through Mr. Cross. But my recollection from that meeting was that there was discussion about how this is a very fluid situation, and that it may be necessary for the EDRST to meet again in short order, as they did, to, should this need to be tweaked, because it as the mayor said, is perhaps likely to need some adjustments and tweaks as we go from round 1 to round 2 to make sure that it's having the greatest impact.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Hales, that's exactly right. We recognize that this is the first time that we will have, if council approves this, we'll have a program of this nature, as well as the fact that we're doing this within a very short time period. So I think that we will learn a few things as a result of going through the first round, if it's approved, where we can modify the second round and make that stronger. That's why we are being very cautious in recommending tying it very closely to what the federal programs are, so that we can take advantage of that learning experience that they have.
Thank you.
Ms. Carr.
Thank you, Mayor. So with regard to round 2, it seems like it probably will not be administered until August. Is that correct?
Mayor Pro Tem, I'll defer to Mr. Cross, because I believe he has the dates in front of him.
Yes, and speaking of dates, that was one of the primary concerns with the programs, some flexibility with the dates. But the initial round 1 will actually start, I think we're projecting for Monday, if approved, and we'll roll it out. Round 2 is set to begin, I believe, on May 15th, and with the new dates that were amended and adjusted, and would run from May 15th to July 17th. But if you noticed in the memo that was sent, because of the discussion of the flexibility of dates and the inability to control the PPP, we adjusted the dates approximately 30 days out from what was originally proposed to the EDRST. And then we also asked for the flexibility for staff to administratively extend the locked in dates up to an additional 30 days to kind of adjust to what was going on as we learn more about how the federal programs are going and how follow-up businesses are following. And then those that weren't eligible for that, what kind of timeframes they need to open up from like stay-at-home orders and things like that. So the short answer to your question is May 15th through July 17th is the initial proposal for round 2 to accept applications.
I don't think that was my question. My question was when they might anticipate receiving the funds.
Okay, well, the funds would be available immediately upon approval of an application showing that they're in compliance with the eligibility guidelines. Now, that said, you know, we're not going to know whether it's 3 days to 5 days, but it will be within a relatively short time frame, especially once we streamline the process. The applications will be ready to go as of Monday for round 1. So if they've got approval at the PP, you know, federal level, and they can show that, we just have that as part of the application. For round 2, we take the applications, we confirm that they're eligible per the eligibility guidelines, should be processed and funding available within, I would say, within a week.
Okay, so then following along, there are 2 components to reviving the economy. The first, of course, is assistance for the businesses themselves. But if you have people who, consumers who are not spending or don't have the money to spend, that's another option or another impediment is what I'm trying to say. So let's assume that somebody applies on May 15th for the round 2 and is immediately approved and then receives it by maybe the 20th or 25th. Will that business be allowed open? I mean, do we even know when the businesses are going to be allowed to be open?
Mayor Pro Tem, as a part of even the round 2, they will need to demonstrate the viability of their business within this environment. So it's not a situation where they will just end up checking a box and get funding. The intention is that they're able to assure that they will end up bringing jobs back or create jobs, one of the 2. So yeah, the reason that we are not having this as just one round is because there's still some work to do for round 2. We have a couple of weeks, I think, to accomplish that, to make sure that we have strong criteria in place that they will need to meet, and recognize that, you know, we may need to come back to you to do some tweaking. But we thought in order to get the funding at least going and flowing, we believe that the first round is very strong. And so that's the one we're placing our emphasis on right now.
Okay, and then finally, because throughout all of this, even the federal program, it's not clear to me how these funds are going to be used. Are they just to allow the business to pay their rent or to hire back employees, or what exactly, in what manner are these funds going to be used, especially if in the county and we are not allowing businesses to open or non-essential businesses to open, and many of these businesses have been classified as non-essential.
Honorable Mayor Pro Tem, in the first round, the emphasis is on payroll, so bringing back jobs, retaining jobs, as well as it actually prohibits the funds being used for rent and capital improvements. So it really is on trying to make sure that we assist businesses with trying to retain their staff during a very difficult time period.
And so I'm thinking of many of the restaurants who are pretty public about the fact that they were essentially not just furloughing, but laying off their staff so that they could receive unemployment insurance, which is appreciated, I'm sure. But will they then be hiring back that staff, or will they be looking for other you know, I guess what I'm saying is those people in particular or anyone?
Honorable Mayor Pro Tem, we don't limit it to simply returning the staff that they had on board prior. Our focus is on, you know, there are millions of people at this point that are unemployed. So I think if they are willing to hire someone and provide a job to them, then that would be a qualifier. But we will look very closely at whether they have been approved for the federal program, for the PPP program, as well as for a small business loan to ensure that they're meeting some criteria that enable them to demonstrate the viability of the business and enable to get at the federal level, typically a forgivable loan as well.
Yeah, it was clearly, it was your question is right on. It was the intent for people to bring their employees back. However, some employees who have been on what we would call enhanced unemployment, if they don't come back, then the business can hire new people to come to work so that they can hit their threshold of the federal requirement of 75% of the loan going for payroll. It's definitely a circuitous route to get money back into the economy. I mean, it's pretty quick, but it's one of those where if the employee chooses not to come back, then the employer has the ability to bring someone else onto the payroll.
Okay, so effectively, we're not just giving money to the business, but we're effectively promoting employment.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. Someone else had a, am I missing anybody?
Stacy.
Stacy, I'm sorry, Stacy.
First of all, for forgiveness, ask forgiveness of my colleagues, I got cut off. So this question was, well, I was out in the wilderness probably for about 3 or 4 minutes. So if this question already got asked, we can move on. But I did have a question about rent. I did hear the mayor in the EDRST meeting talk about some of the dynamics, particularly in the East Loop, which is not our province, related to rent. But I know businesses perhaps further up on Del Mar and certainly those on Olive, I think the dynamics are a little bit different in terms of rent and that being a need for these businesses. Can you talk about why that was excluded as a legitimate cost or expenditure?
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clegg, sure. The focus of the program is really on job creation, job retention. And so it was believed that rent simply didn't their ability to pay their rent was more closely tied to the viability of the business. Are they generating enough revenue to sustain themselves? And so if you look at it from that perspective, then the most critical issue is, do they have the staff on board, or are they able to bring the staff back that's going to be needed to work there? So it's really just a policy decision for the council to make. The way the program is structured is simply focuses more on other things such as payroll and making sure that people are employed. But sure, you could easily change that to rent. We just structured it in a way because we believe that the focus should be on reviving the economy. In order to do that, you need the personnel.
So let me ask this follow-up question, and I think in the mayor, we may be able to, we have an expert who can perhaps provide an answer. I'm thinking of barbershops, beauty salons, may have multiple folks in there. They are not considered employees of that business, correct?
Depends. It depends. Clearly, in my particular situation, they're all employees of my company. There are others who rent space or who are independent contractors. And those who rent space or independent contractors, they actually file for their own PPP program because they're in essence self-employed.
Because I'm concerned about salons and not understanding clearly the individual dynamics of each salon. you have a circumstance where if they don't have employees in the traditional sense, can they leverage, is there a way for them to leverage these funds?
Well, the same is, again, I always want to disclose, yes, this is a business that I'm in, but if the owner of a salon doesn't have employees, the owner of the salon still charges for their services and still makes their own money separate from the rent from their employees. So that owner then can get their own PPP funds for their lost revenues to bring themselves back. And that was a part of this program as well. So those who are in that particular type of situation, the owner of the salon would get their own PPP loan. The stylist would get their own PPP loan. The whole bit. That's a little different. That's a different situation than mine, where everybody's an employee. Our concern on the rent was that, and again, this may be a little bit in my particular case, where most of the landlords have been agreeing. They number one, many times will send you a letter that you need to abide by all of your terms of release, which I think that's just due notice. And then usually the second communication is, well, we're here to help you. Do we need to credit you? Do we need to give you a little discount? Most of the folks are really, at least my landlords, are willing to defer a month's rent so that they add it on to the end of the lease. Does that make sense? If you're not going to pay May's rent, they're just going to add one more month on in the lease. So that sort of makes my guess is that most landlords are probably in that vein right now. Of course, I don't know that. That's a little bit anecdotal, but the goal here was to get money to the street pretty quickly with a program that was already done federally without too many changes to it, so that we could get funds into the hands of our businesses quickly on phase one. Then I think phase two is the one that really is much more robust. I think you're going to see participation in phase two be a lot higher than phase one.
And I agree. I just want to make clear in my own mind, our salons or our barbershops who may not have employees in the traditional sense, they can access these university city funds.
If they, in phase, I don't mean to speak for Cliff, but or the city manager, but if they participate in the federal PPP program and they were okay.
Well, right. Phase two is more what I'm speaking to.
Yeah. John?
I mean,
I was going to add, so with respect to stylists, do stylists pay sales taxes? Are their customers charged sales taxes? And if not, then would they generate any EDRST contribution? Because remember, this program is the concept is the taxes generated from your business that are placed in the EDRST fund, those will become available and for the claimant. So if you have a business that does not engage in retail sales, my understanding is that the claim amount for that business would be zero.
And Cliff, do they? I don't know.
I'm sorry, kind of broke up on me.
You were nodding your head. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, no, John touched on it. I mean, it's based on a one-to-one contribution. So, I mean, the one thing I think is worth noting, if you're an individual stylist under a total business umbrella and all the generated tax is filtered through that business, that would be up to the individual business that's applying for this then to kind of redistribute it back. But if you're an individual stylist and you pay absolutely no sales tax into the fund, even if you made an application, you're not getting anything out of it because it's not a one-to-one. So there's nothing that restricts from each individual stylist getting it through who they basically rent from, but they individually could not seek it.
But the business itself, so Stacy's Barbershop, I have unlike the mayor's situation, my employees are not they're not my employees. They just work there. They rent space. Is Stacy's Barbershop eligible?
Well, I think it depends. It depends upon, Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, depends upon whether you have participated and actually contributed to the economic development retail sales tax. So if you're Stacy's Barbershop and you charge a tax that ultimately went into that fund, then yes, you'd be able to participate. But if you are Stacy's Barbershop and you did not, then you might be eligible, but the amount that you would get is zero because it's a one-to-one. Whatever you have contributed to the EDRST sales tax fund is what you actually get out of it.
Thank you for that
Okay.
clarification. Correct, because are there other questions? I'm not seeing anyone's hand up, and we've not placed a motion on the floor yet. And hang on one second. I just want to make sure, John, is there a particular way, since I know we've moved through this pretty quickly, is there a particular way this motion needs to be presented to us? And I'm assuming if Wayne would like to make an amendment, then that's fine too. But at some point in time, I'd like to make sure that this motion is in an appropriate format so that my colleagues have a clear understanding of what they're doing, and we've got an idea of the flexibility that we have that we've all talked about.
Yes. With respect to the motion, it would be to approve the small business assistance program as recommended by the city manager. And you have those documents before you, and looking through them though, I'm looking for an amount, and what I've heard is 500,000 for round one, and that is in fact reflected in the round one guidelines. So you have at this point potentially 500,000 round one, and then round two is you have potentially 500,000 committed to that. So I guess to your question, the motion would be to approve the small business assistance program as recommended by the city manager in his report.
Mr. Hales, do you have a question or making a motion?
I'm ready to make the motion.
Okay, Mr. Hales makes a motion. Is there a second?
I make the second.
Seconded by Ms. Carr. So we've got seconded. Now, are there now questions either regarding the motion or amendments to? I got Mr. Smotherson, and I've got Mr. Clay.
Okay,
I defer to Councilman Smotherson.
I'd like to make the motion to amend the motion or request to remove forgiveness and make this just a loan.
Okay, you have an amendment on the floor by Mr. Smotherson. Is there a second to removal of the forgiveness portion? Seeing that,
No, you have a hand for Paulette.
Paulette, is that a second?
Yep.
Yeah, this is second for the sake of discussion.
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
you have before you now an amendment to talk about forgiveness, which Mr. Smotherson.
Yes, sir. Again, thank you, Mayor Crow, and thank you, Paulette. The reason, my concern is the city's position in the future. I'm absolutely concerned about the city being in a positive position where we can have a reaction and affect our economic situation in the future, meaning a year from now or 2 years from now. And if we're dwindled down to 300,000 a year in the next year, and 300,000 in the next year after that, or even less, that million becomes really critical in kickstarting the city in the economic situation. So that to me is the real concern that I have, that we're not weakening ourselves in reference to kickstarting us back into a normal process. But also, one of the things that I also understand too is that if we make it a loan, we can always go back and later down the line make it a forgiving loan or forgiveness loan. But we can't go back the opposite way. If we make this a forgiving loan, then we can't go back and make it a loan. So again, I just want to make sure that everybody understands I am really concerned about the city's position in the future so that we maintain a positive position as strongly as we can. And then the last part of my statement is that I just have a real concern about the fact that we've let people go. And then on the other side of the building, we're giving away money. So that's and I want to respect that action. So again, and respect those people. So that's my reasoning. And I'm hoping everybody else can understand that.
Mr. Clay.
No, I was just indicating, I was pointing to Councilwoman Carr, which you couldn't really see.
Oh, okay.
But she had the second, so that's why I had my hand up.
Mr. Kusick, I apologize, I didn't see you.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to just say that I am in favor of giving these, not as loans, but giving this money without any stipulation of the money to pay back. I agree with what Mr. Smotherson is saying, that we need to think about what's going to be happening with University City down the road. We also need to understand that if we don't have our businesses, if we can't do something now to help the businesses that are hurting, and if we can't do something immediately and make this money available to them, they may not be around to be able to contribute this fall and next year and going forward. So I think that this is not the federal government buyout, and we don't have millions and millions and millions to put into this, but just a little bit of money that we had. Get this money to these businesses as quick as possible and allow them to get back into doing business so that they can survive. So I would be opposed to this amendment.
Well, Tim, and I will say that, addressing that, what I'm suggesting changes nothing in reference to what we're doing. It changes absolutely nothing other than making it a loan, because it doesn't change the money that it's available. I mean, I'm not changing any of the program or any descriptions that we're talking about. All I'm simply saying that I would like to see us make this position first before we move into, and we can always move into another phase of this in making that forgiveness. But I'm not changing any other terms at all, other than the fact that it's not a forgiveness loan. That's it.
But
And I understand that. Thank you.
however, at the same point in time, the most attractive thing to most businesses is that it is for a forgiven loan.
Well, but that also then tells you something, I think.
Ms. Carr.
Thank you. So, so it seems to me that we, to address what Dwayne said, we need to recognize that this quarter is basically a bust, and that the funding that we will be receiving into the EDRST fund will be substantially smaller than it would normally be. And that all that means is that the programs that we support next year would have to meet what we have. I mean, that, you know, it's not that we would necessarily collapse. I do think that that if you burden a business that is not viable, and we have a lot of, it looks like, criteria for determining whether this business is viable. So if you burden a business that is not viable, they may not be able to make that turnaround. I mean, but if they take the loan and we have agreed that they're viable or somewhat viable, and they fail on it, my question is does that loan then become due? Is it paid back within 2 years at 0.5, I believe, %? Or I assume if the business fails, they can declare bankruptcy. I'm just asking a few questions that seem kind of open to me still.
Is that a question for me?
I don't know
again,
whether,
yeah.
I don't know whether John would be the person to answer that, or the city
Right, 'cause-
manager.
Yeah, Paulette, I'm simply saying that I'm not changing anything. That those conditions would still apply. I'm not changing anything other than, and one thing I will say, Paulette, is that as the city, we can be as flexible with this as we want to be. We can be. I mean, payback can be flexible as, you know, as we determine, or the city manager determines, or Cliff, or whoever's in charge of that. We can be flexible.
Honorable Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, as it relates to the ability to recapture the funds, I think that if the business fails to meet the criteria that's been outlined, you know, regarding bringing people back to work, then we'd consider that a default, and then it would revert to a loan, a typical loan, I think, with 5% interest. Regarding your other question about if they end up filing for bankruptcy, we would be in the same position as any other bank would be, in the sense that it would be, we could pursue trying to recover some of our loan, but that would still be a very difficult endeavor.
Thank you.
Someone else, I saw a hand someplace. Mr. Mulligan, then Mr. Hales.
Just as a clarification, I'm not sure if everybody heard the city manager, we said 5%, I think it was 0.5%.
That's what I said.
As a 1/2 of 1%. So
Right.
1%
That's
over
what I
2
said.
years.
Yeah, that's
John,
what I
I'm
said.
trying to get more.
Mr. Hales, was that your comment? You were getting more.
That was one of my questions, but I also did want to respond and reiterate something that the mayor said earlier, because I think it's really important to those watching, that these funds that we're talking about are funds that are paid in to the economic development retail sales tax, which is paid by the businesses we're talking about, which goes into a very restricted fund. And so while I think we all appreciate the challenges that the city is dealing with right now in terms of changes in projected revenues, these funds cannot be diverted to the general fund to pay salaries of various people who have been furloughed, and cannot be used for purposes other than the business related purposes that this fund was created for. As the mayor said, I think it was roughly almost 40 years ago now that this was created. And that is what we are talking about. So it's not, for folks watching, like, we are not talking about taking money from the general fund. This is a very specific fund that was created for business related purposes. That's all.
Ms. Carr.
Just for clarification, the EDRST board was initiated in 2006. I remember voting for that because I thought that we needed an economic development tax. So it's not quite 40 years old. That's the age of the loop.
That's right. I'm sorry. I confused the LSPD, I think.
Yeah, that
So-
doesn't have anything to do with the other validity of your
He was
point.
rounding up. He was rounding up. I think I said decades.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm looking on screens and I see no one else asking a question. You have before you an amendment proposed by Mr. Smotherson and seconded by Ms. Carr. Hearing no further discussion on that, those in favor of Mr. Smotherson's amendment, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Nay,
Nay.
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 I believe the nays have it. You now have before you a proposal that a motion that was made, I think, by Mr. Hales, I think, and
Hales.
seconded by Ms. Carr. I'm not
That's correct.
trying to remember all of that. Is
That's
there any
correct.
further discussion on the original motion? And I'm still seeing no one on the screen. Mr. Clay. Mr.
Yes.
Clay.
Can that be read one more time? I thought I had it, but the motion can be read one more time?
Well, Mr. Mulligan delivered that motion. I don't know whether Ms. Reese, do you have it down?
I believe I have it.
Okay.
It's a motion to approving the SB, the Small Business Assistance Program, as presented by the city manager, and his report is $500K for the first round and $500K for the second round.
That's correct.
That's
Okay.
correct.
So understanding that, I think we've acknowledged that round 2 and the criteria associated with that needs some more development. And let me just, is that a correct assumption? That there's some things that need to be added. We're focused on round 1, as I heard the city manager. articulate earlier, round two needs some more development. City Manager Rose, is that a correct interpretation?
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, our intention is certainly to focus more on round two to ensure that it is structured in a way that meets the intent, which, you know, in some instances is to make sure that we are promoting a program that is equitable. So I would suspect that before we start approving and even requesting applications for round two, we will likely revisit this with the mayor and council.
And I'm glad to hear that, because I do, as you might have gathered by my last line of questioning, do have grave concerns about some of our businesses. And, you know, hair salons and barbershops just came to mind, but there may be others in that category that I want to make sure that we're thinking deeply about. So no one inadvertently, we're moving 1,000 miles an hour. I think we all know why, but in our haste to get the funds out, I don't want to leave out, you know, 10, 15, 20% of our businesses that for various and sundry reasons, we find out later on, can't apply at all. And so I'm very concerned about that dynamic that can happen in a situation of well-intentioned haste. So I can vote for this, but I think it needs to be done so with the understanding that you are coming back to us within round two. Now, if I need to make an amendment to that effect, I'm happy to do so.
The way the amendment or the way the approval is structured and based upon the conversation, Cliff, I'm going to defer to you a little bit. I think that we will have time to bring the criteria back to the mayor and council at its May 11th meeting before we actually execute the round two program.
That is correct. And that, you know, that was discussed about some potential tweaks to round two. But to respond to your question specifically in reference to eligible businesses, the way the current round two guidelines are written, any business that pays retail sales tax is eligible. If you pay retail sales tax, you're eligible to apply. And you will get back out of it what's in it. So, I mean, quite honestly, with the specifics of the way it's structured, any business is eligible to apply. And to the question about the time frame of when they can apply, if you look at the wording specifically in that, it says when it kicks in, the business reopens within 2 weeks after obtaining funds. And we specifically worded it like that because we'll have a better gauging of at the time the business starts to make the application of when they can potentially reopen, and then they can obtain the funds 2 weeks prior to that. So that time frame is kind of built in there. And then in addition, that's why we asked for the 30-day extension for staff to administratively take it out. But the answer to your question specifically is, yes, we could still take this to the EDRST in an emergency meeting next week and then get any revisions back to the mayor and council May 11th.
I just want a point of clarification. I'm not sure that it will need to go back to the EDRST board for consideration because I believe that they recognize that there might be a tweaking of the program when it was approved. But will you have a meeting scheduled on May the 11th that certainly we can bring the criteria back to council just to confirm that you're comfortable with it?
Yeah, for round two, and again, that's where my comments are directed.
Yeah.
The first round, we can go ahead. I know there are businesses both in the Loop and in other areas on Olive that can be eligible for the round one funding immediately. So I don't want to inhibit that in any way, but round two, I do want more conversation about.
Mr. Mulligan.
Thank you, Mayor. To Councilmember Quay's question about round two funding, one thing that was made available at the Economic Development Retail Sales Tax Board meeting and is publicly available, it's on our website, is how we determine what funds would be available for these programs. There was roughly $1.3 million of uncommitted funds that are available for economic development programs. So the recommendation is that 1 million of that would be made available. Now, if every business that's eligible for this applied and you've got 100% take on round one, it'd be a little under 500,000. So this is not going to be a situation where businesses are fighting to, if they don't get in, if their application's not first, they lose out. So everybody potentially can get 100% of what was contributed. Now, you would expect that you won't get 100%. I mean, typically, for whatever reason, you're not going to have every business that's eligible applying. So you may have some money left over from that first $500,000, and then you're agreeing to appropriate 500,000 for that round one and 500 for round two. So, as you see, as the city manager reports on the experience with round one, certainly the council would have flexibility if for instance, only 100,000 was claimed during round one, council may say, well, we want to shift that money to round two, or we want to, just leave it as is. So I think that, as Cliff said, that, there'd be some reporting and you could see how things went with round one, going into round two. But as it stands, you're agreeing to appropriate, 500 and 500 K for each round.
Mr. Kusick.
Yes, I think I need some clarification. The motion is that we're considering, we are considering both round one and round two at this point, not just round one, but both of them, correct?
Correct.
Yes, and I just wanted that clarification because I thought Mr. Clay was saying that he was wanting to delay the vote on round two.
No, I don't know.
No, I'm not asking to delay the vote. The criteria is not fully fleshed out, I think, as we've articulated here. And so what I hear the city manager committing to do is coming back with more substantial criteria related to round two at our May 11th meeting.
Honorable Mayor, Councilmember Clay, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
And frankly, if not sooner.
Yeah.
Not sooner. So are there any
On or before?
On or before, yes.
Hearing no other discussion, those in favor of the motion on the floor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it. We have now concluded the city manager's report very quickly. And before we move into closed session, I would like for everyone to remind the public that's watching that to please fill out your census forms. It's critical for us as much as possible to have everyone be counted. And then to my colleagues on the council, the food bank, St. Louis Area Food Bank has made outreach to St. Louis County and to the mayors of the metropolitan area to have a food drive on Saturday, May the 9th. And we are looking for our city to participate in that, likely either at the one of the firehouses or police station, whatever the case may be. We'll get details out on that. We would love for any of you to volunteer and frankly, to help us get the word out as we decide how to help replenish the St. Louis Area Food Bank's low shelves. With that, could we have a motion to go into closed session according to Missouri Revised Statute 610.021, legal action, litigation involving a public governmental body and confidential privileged communications between the body and their attorneys? So a motion by Ms. Carr, seconded by Mr. McMahon. Any discussion? Hearing none. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Hales.
Aye.
Councilmember Kusick.
Aye.
Councilmember Smotherson.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay.
Aye.
Councilmember Carr.
Aye.
Councilmember McMahon.
Aye.
Mayor Crowe.
Aye. Thank you very much to the public for participating this evening. To the council members, you have another Zoom invitation that you have ready for you. Thank you very much.